The gala at Sterling Global wasn't just a party. It was a coronation. High above the smog of the city, the penthouse of the Sterling Tower glowed like a captured star. Inside, the air smelled of expensive oud, vintage champagne, and the suffocating scent of unchecked ego. Maya Vance moved through the crowd like a ghost at 29. Her back was straighter than any of the debutantes in silk gowns. A lingering habit from her years as a chief warrant officer too. But in her starch white waitress apron and sensible black shoes, she was invisible. To the titans of industry surrounding her, she was merely a mobile tray for hors d'oeuvres. Her hands, which had once guided a 12-ton medevac helicopter through the sandstorms of the Middle East, now trembled slightly as she balanced a silver platter of caviar blinis. It wasn't the weight of the tray that bothered her. It was the noise. The sharp pop of champagne corks sounded too much like distant small arms fire. The flashes of the paparazzi's cameras felt like the strobes of an emergency beacon. "Excuse me, girl." The voice was like a whip. Maya froze, then slowly turned. Julian Sterling, the CEO and boy wonder of Silicon Valley, stood there. He was draped in a $5,000 suit, his eyes bright with the cruelty that often comes with inherited billions. Beside him stood Arthur Penhaligon, the CFO, a man with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that never stayed still. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" Maya's voice was low, disciplined. Julian didn't look at her face. He looked at his shoes. A single, tiny droplet of champagne had splashed onto the hand-burnished Italian leather. "You're leaking," he sneered, pointing to her tray. "This footwear costs more than your annual rent. I expect the help to have better spatial awareness." A few socialites nearby snickered. Maya felt the heat crawl up her neck. "I apologize, sir. The floor is slightly uneven near the vent." "The floor is perfect. You are the variable," Julian snapped. He looked her up and down, his lip curling. "I see your type everywhere. You walk around with that hollow stare, acting like you're carrying the weight of the world. What's the matter? Did the community college nursing program not work out? Or are you just naturally built for service?" Quote, Arthur, the CFO, let out a dry chuckle. "Careful, Julian. She might have dreams. She might think she's the next CEO." Julian laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. He gestured toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind them. On the rooftop pad, his Eurocopter EC-135 sat bathed in floodlights. A masterpiece of titanium and carbon fiber. "Look at that machine," Julian whispered, leaning into Maya's personal space. "That is the pinnacle of human engineering. It requires a mind capable of calculating 1,000 variables a second. You struggle with a tray of toast. Tell me, do you even know what a cyclic is? Or do you just think it's a brand of laundry detergent?" Quote, Maya looked at the helicopter. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Not with fear, but with a sudden, violent longing. She knew that machine. She knew its soul. She knew how to make it dance in a crosswind and how to whisper it back to earth when the engines screamed in agony. "I know what it is, sir," Maya said, her voice trembling with suppressed lightning. "No, you don't," Julian dismissed her, turning his back. "Clean up your mess and disappear. Some people are born to fly, and others are born to mop up the dirt we leave behind. Learn your place, Vance. It's on the floor." As she walked away, her vision blurred. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, ridged edge of her Bronze Star Challenge coin. She squeezed it until the metal bit into her palm, drawing blood. He had no idea. None of them did. The gala continued to roar above, but the basement levels of Sterling Global were a different world. A world of fluorescent hums and the rhythmic swish thud of Maya's industrial floor buffer. Here, The air was thick with the scent of lemon ammonia and the silence of the forgotten. Maya worked with mechanical precision, her mind a fortress. Every time Julian's mocking laugh echoed in her memory, she pushed the buffer harder. The machine vibrating through her arms. Learn your place, Vance. It's on the floor. She reached the 42nd floor, the executive suite, at 2 a.m. This was the inner sanctum, where the walls were paneled in rare mahogany and the carpets were so thick they felt like walking through a marsh. As she approached the heavy double doors of the CFO's office, she noticed a sliver of light spilling onto the marble. Maya paused. The cleaning schedule said the floor should be empty. She was about to turn away when a voice, sharp, panicked, and unmistakably Arthur Penhaligon's, sliced through the door. I told you, the money is coming. The insurance payout on the EC-135 is tiered at $15 million. It's a clean loss. Total hull destruction. Maya's hand froze on the handle of her cleaning cart. She shrunk back into the shadows of the alcove, her military training taking over. Her breathing went shallow. Her heart rate dropped into a tactical rhythm. Julian is taking the bird to the island tomorrow morning, Arthur continued, his voice pacing the room. The FADEC, the engine control unit, has been flashed with a corrupted ghost script. At 5,000 feet, the fuel mixture will lean out until the turbines flame out. No warning, no restart capability. By the time they realize the electronics are fried, they'll be a kinetic dart heading for the Atlantic. A muffled, gravelly voice responded over a speakerphone. A voice that sounded like it belonged to the kind of men Maya used to hunt in the dark. And my debt, Arthur? The mob doesn't wait for probate court. You'll get your $5 million by Friday. Arthur hissed. Julian is a dead man flying. I've already positioned myself to take the interim CEO seat. The board will be too busy mourning their visionary to notice the ledger discrepancies. Maya felt a cold shiver trace her spine. This wasn't just corporate greed. It was cold-blooded execution. She looked down at her hands. The hands Julian had said were only fit for mops. She knew that helicopter, the Eurocopter EC-135, was a beast. But it was a digital beast if the FADEC was sabotaged. The pilot wouldn't have a second to react. The engine would simply quit, and the rotor RPM would decay into a death spiral. Suddenly, the office door creaked. Maya ducked behind her high-capacity trash bin just as Arthur stepped out. He looked haggard, his silk tie loosened like a noose around his neck. He scanned the hallway, his eyes lingering on the cleaning cart for a heart-stopping second. Who's there? He barked. Maya stayed perfectly still, her face pressed against the cold plastic of the bin. She counted his heartbeats by the sound of his heavy footfalls. Finally, Arthur grunted and walked toward the elevators. Once the ping signaled his departure, Maya stood up. Her eyes were no longer those of a ghost in the lobby. They were the eyes of a chief warrant officer. She didn't head for the exit. She headed for the service stairs that led to the roof. She had 3 hours until sunrise. She couldn't call the police. Arthur would have deleted the digital trail. And who would believe a waitress accusing a CFO of high-tech murder? She had to do what she had spent 10 years doing in the army. She had to save a life. Even the life of a man who had spat on her soul. You want to see what a variable looks like, Julian? She whispered to the empty hallway. Watch this. The wind whipped at Maya's coveralls as she stepped onto the rooftop. It was 3:30 a.m. The city below was a galaxy of lights. But up here, it was desolate and exposed. The black silhouette of the Eurocopter EC-135 sat center stage, illuminated only by the intermittent wash of the security beacons. Maya didn't have her uniform, her crew, or her diagnostic tools. She had a Leatherman multi-tool, a heavy-duty flashlight muffled with a red filter, and the ghost of 10,000 flight hours. She moved with an ethereal, lethal grace. Her focus was absolute. She bypassed the proximity sensors not with high-tech gear, but by timing the sweep of the main security camera and moving through its blind spots. Tactics learned in Afghanistan, not cleaning school. She reached the helicopter. Up close. It was beautiful, but to her, it was now a loaded weapon pointed at Julian's head. She accessed the maintenance panel near the engine cowling. Her fingers, despite the biting cold, were steady. She cracked the panel and shone her red light inside. The FADEC, the dual-channel engine controller, was a silver box the size of a toaster. To the untrained eye, the wiring harness looked perfect. But Arthur's technician was good. Maya had to look for microscopic clues. She found it, a tiny, unshielded lead on the data bus. A splice that shouldn't be there. That was the injection point for the ghost script. She couldn't flash the memory back to its original state. She didn't have the hardware. If she tried to cut the splice, the system would register a critical fault and lock out the ignition. Think, Vance. The ground instructor's voice echoed in her mind. If you can't bypass the threat, overwhelm it. She studied the schematic, visualizing the logic flow. The sabotage script required a specific set of parameters, altitude over 4,500 feet and stable torque. If she could disrupt those readings with the precision of a surgeon, she manipulated the wiring. She didn't cut, she rerouted. Using a piece of wire she stripped from her own flashlight, she jury-rigged a bypass from the torque sensor to the main data bus. By doing this, she ensured that at higher altitudes, the FADEC would receive erratic, spiking torque readings. This would be a nightmare for the pilot. The engine would hunt, revving and dipping. It would feel like the bird was breaking apart, but it wouldn't trigger the flame-out script. Maya was banking on the pilot's instinct to panic, to believe the systems were failing now, and to initiate an immediate emergency descent below the kill altitude. She closed the panel, securing the Zeus fasteners, but she wasn't done. She slipped into the main cabin, her knees brushing the leather seats Julian had prioritized over her humanity. She moved to the cockpit, on the center console, next to the emergency checklist. She placed the object she had carried with her since the day she was discharged. Her Bronze Star Challenge coin. It was heavy, bronze, engraved with the eagle of the army and the motto, Sign Metu, without fear. Beside it, she left a single, folded napkin from the gala. She had scrawled 4 words on it with a grease pencil. Below 4,500. Trust the glide. It was a riddle that made sense only in the cockpit. If the pilot didn't understand it, the coin might at least make him pause. And in the logic-defying chaos of a FADEC failure, a single pause could be the difference between life and death. Maya wiped her fingerprints from the console and melted back into the shadows just as the elevator hummed to life. The morning shift was arriving. The invisible pilot was gone. The sun rose over the Atlantic like a bleeding wound, casting long, amber shadows across the Sterling Tower helipad. Julian Sterling stepped out of the pressurized elevator, his sharp suit replaced by high-end tactical leisure wear. He looked refreshed, untouched by the cruelty he'd dispensed the night before. Behind him followed a young, polished pilot named Miller, carrying a flight bag that looked like it had never seen a speck of grease. Beautiful morning for a flight, Mr. Sterling, Miller said, performing a perfunctory pre-flight walk-around. Make it fast, Miller. I have a 10 a.m. meeting on the Vineyard, Julian replied, his eyes already glued to his smartphone. He didn't look at the maintenance panels Maya had touched. He didn't look at the skid marks on the roof. He simply climbed into the leather-bound cabin, the door sealing with a quiet, expensive thud. Miller settled into the cockpit, flipping switches with practiced ease. The twin turbines began their mechanical whine, rising to a scream that vibrated through the floorboards. As Miller reached for the emergency checklist, his hand brushed against something cold and heavy. He looked down. There, wedged into the corner of the center console, was a bronze coin. It bore the crest of a U.S. Army aviation unit. Tucked beneath it was a crumpled white napkin from the gala. "Sir, did you leave this here?" Miller asked over the intercom. Julian glanced up, annoyed. "Leave what?" "Quote, a challenge coin, and a note." Miller read the grease pencil scrawl. "Below 4,500. Trust the glide." Julian snorted, a sound of pure derision. "It's probably some trash left by that waitress. She was hovering around the windows last night. Just throw it in the bin." Miller. "Some people think a lucky charm can replace a real education. Get us in the air." Miller hesitated. He had been a civilian pilot his whole life. But he knew what a challenge coin represented. It was a symbol of blood, sweat, and survival. He didn't throw it away. Instead, he shoved it into his flight suit pocket, unsure why his heart was suddenly racing. Towers. Sterling 1 Alpha. Departing for Martha's Vineyard. Requesting climb to 6,000. Miller spoke into his headset. Sterling 1 Alpha. Cleared for takeoff. Wind 300 at 10 knots. The Eurocopter lifted. It was a smooth, gravity-defying surge. Below them, the city began to shrink into a toy model of itself. Maya Vance stood at the window of the 40th floor breakroom, her hand resting on the glass. She watched the black speck of the helicopter rise. A dark bird flying into a trap. "Maya, you okay?" Her supervisor called out. "You've been staring at that roof for 10 minutes. Get back to the floors. We have the board meeting prep on 42. Maya didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the horizon. In the cockpit, the altimeter ticked upward. 1,000 feet, 2,500 feet, 3,000 feet. Everything was perfect. The vibration was minimal. The fuel flow was steady. Julian was back on his phone, oblivious to the fact that they were crossing the invisible line into the CFO's kill zone. 4,000 feet. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out beneath them. A vast, churning gray abyss. 4,200 feet. Suddenly, the cockpit went silent. Not the silence of a quiet room, but the terrifying, vacuum-like silence of dual-engine failure. The master caution light didn't just blink. It turned a steady, screaming red. The digital displays flickered, then began to vomit gibberish. The ghost script had arrived. "What the?" Miller gasped, his hands flying to the controls. "Engines flamed out. I lost both turbines. I have no FADEC control." Quote, Julian's phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. "What do you mean? Restart them." Quote, "I can't. The system is locked. We're falling. Julian, we're falling." Quote, the helicopter's nose pitched down. The roar of the wind against the windshield became a howl. They were no longer flying. They were a $15 million brick dropping toward the freezing sea. The silence was the most terrifying part. A helicopter is a machine held in the air by sheer mechanical aggression. When that aggression stops, the world turns into a tomb. At 4,800 feet, the EC-135's rotors began to slow, their rhythmic thwack-thwack fading into a pathetic, whistling moan. "Mayday! Mayday! Sterling 1 Alpha. Dual engine failure. We are losing RPM." Miller's voice was an octave higher, cracking under the pressure of imminent death. He fought the cyclic, but the digital flight controls were twitching, fighting his inputs. Julian Sterling, the man who owned the sky only yesterday, was shoved forward against his harness. The G-force of the sudden drop made his stomach heave. "Do something, Miller. Use the backup." Use the emergency override. Quote, it's not responding. The computer is rejecting the manual command. Miller screamed. He was staring at a screen that was now a chaotic kaleidoscope of red X symbols. Arthur's sabotage was a masterpiece of digital assassination. The helicopter didn't know it was falling. It thought it was already shut down on a hangar floor. 4,000 feet. The ocean was no longer a beautiful blue carpet. It was a jagged, gray maw rising to swallow them. The altimeter was spinning clockwise like a frantic clock. We're going to hit the water, Julian whispered. The realization hit him with a coldness that champagne could never mimic. All his billions, his patents, his skyscrapers, they were worth nothing in a cockpit with no torque. Then, Miller felt something hard in his flight suit pocket. The coin. In a moment of pure, adrenaline-fueled lucidity, Miller remembered the napkin. Below 4,500. Trust the glide. Julian. The note. The waitress's note. Miller yelled. What? Julian's face was ghostly pale. His eyes wide with the primal fear of a trapped animal. The note said, below 4,500. Trust the glide. We're at 3,800 now. She knew this was coming. Miller reached out and grabbed the emergency mechanical throttle, the one that should have been bypassed by the computer. He saw the challenge coin Maya had wedged into the gap of the console. It wasn't just a lucky charm. It was a physical shim. Because the coin was jammed into the console's side panel, it was preventing a specific safety interlock from engaging. An interlock that the sabotage script was trying to use to lock the fuel valves shut. Maya hadn't just left a message. She had performed a mechanical bypass using 3 ounces of bronze. I'm going into auto-rotation, Miller shouted. In a helicopter, auto-rotation is the equivalent of a Hail Mary. You pitch the nose down. Let the rushing air turn the blades like a windmill. And pray you have enough kinetic energy to flare at the last second for a survivable landing. It requires nerves of steel and perfect timing. She said trust the glide, Miller hissed through gritted teeth. He shoved the collective down, dumping the pitch of the blades. The helicopter pitched forward violently. Julian screamed as they dived toward the whitecaps of the Atlantic. To anyone watching, it looked like a suicide dive. But Miller felt the rotors begin to pick up speed again. Not from the engines, but from the physics of the fall. 2,500 feet. It's working, Miller gasped. His hands trembling on the controls. The blades are spinning back up. We have a glide path. But they were still over the open ocean. If they hit the water, the heavy engines would flip the bird upside down in seconds, trapping them in a watery cage. Look, Julian pointed a shaking finger. A small, sand-stripped barrier island sat 3 miles ahead. It was little more than a strip of dunes and dead grass. There, can you make it? Quote, Miller looked at the island, then at his airspeed. It was going to be 1,000 to 1 shot. He needed every inch of altitude. He needed the skill of a combat pilot. He needed the woman he had dismissed as the help. 1,500 feet. I don't know if I can flare in time, Miller admitted. Tears of frustration blurring his vision. I've only done this in a simulator. Julian, I've never done a dead stick landing for real. Quote, back at the tower, Maya Vance sat in the locker room, her head in her hands. She was whispering the auto-rotation counts under her breath. Nose down. Maintain 70 knots. Wait for the ground effect. Flare. Level. Cushion. Live. You arrogant bastard, she whispered. Live so you can see what you almost threw away. The ocean was a blur of salt spray and gray-green fury. 800 feet. The Eurocopter was no longer a luxury vehicle. It was a whistling, vibrating metal beast screaming toward the earth. Miller, we're too fast, Julian screamed, his hands gripping the leather seat so hard the seams began to pop. You're going to fly us straight into the sand. Quote, "Shut up, Julian," Miller roared back, his eyes bloodshot. He was staring at the strip of sand known as Dead Man's Shoal. He could feel the air pressure building under the blades. The ground effect. He had one chance to convert his downward velocity into a horizontal cushion. 300 feet. The sand rushed up like a wall. 100 feet. Now, Miller pulled back on the cyclic with everything he had. The helicopter's nose flared up sharply, acting like a giant air brake. This was the flare. For a heartbeat, the aircraft seemed to hover, defying gravity as the kinetic energy of the rotors reached its peak. The sound was deafening, a tectonic groan of metal under immense G-force. Crunch. The skids hit the soft dunes. The helicopter bounced once, tilted dangerously to the left, and then slammed into the sand with a bone-jarring thud. The rotors, deprived of their momentum, slowing to a jagged, scraping halt against a tall dune. Silence returned, broken only by the sound of the Atlantic waves and the ticking of cooling metal. Julian Sterling sat in the back, gasping for air. He was alive. He checked his limbs. He was bruised, but whole. He looked at Miller, who was slumped over the controls, sobbing with relief. Julian unbuckled his harness and pushed the door open. The salty air hit him, sharp and cold. He tumbled out onto the sand, his expensive tactical leisure wear covered in grit and oil. He looked back at the machine that had nearly become his coffin. "The coin," Julian muttered, his voice a dry rasp. He climbed back into the cockpit and reached for the center console. He pulled the Bronze Star Challenge coin from the gap where it had been wedged. It was warm to the touch. He held it up to the light, staring at the Army crest. Then he looked at the napkin again. Below 4,500. Trust the glide. A memory flashed in his mind. Not of the crash, but of the gala. He saw the way he had looked down at Maya Vance. He remembered the sting of his own words. Some people are born to fly, and others are born to mop up the dirt we leave behind. He felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea. It wasn't from the crash. It was the realization that the woman he had treated like a ghost had seen the wind before it even blew. She hadn't just predicted the failure. She had engineered a way for them to survive it. "Miller," Julian called out, standing on the dunes. "Yeah, sir?" Miller climbed out, wiping his face. "Who did you say left this?" Quote, "The waitress, sir. The one from last night." Maya. Julian looked at the coin in his palm. It wasn't a lucky charm. It was a message. It was a resume written in blood and bronze. "We need to get off this beach," Julian said, his eyes hardening with a new kind of intensity. "But we aren't going to the vineyard. We're going back to the tower. I need to find out why my helicopter turned into a rock. And I need to find the woman who taught it how to fly again." He looked at his phone. It was smashed, the screen a spider web of cracks. He threw it into the ocean. He didn't need a phone to know that his world had just shifted on its axis. Back at Sterling Global, the atmosphere was a tomb. Word had reached the executive floor that Julian's helicopter had vanished from radar over the Atlantic. No emergency signal, no wreckage found, just a silent blip that had blinked out of existence. In the boardroom on the 42nd floor, Arthur Penhaligon was already presiding over an emergency meeting. He didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a kingmaker. "It is a tragedy beyond words," Arthur said, his voice a practiced tremolo of fake grief. Julian was a visionary, but the company must endure. "As CFO, I am stepping in as interim CEO to stabilize our stock price and oversee the investigation." Maya Vance stood just outside the boardroom, a trash bag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other. She listened through the heavy oak doors, her jaw tight. She knew exactly what Arthur was doing. He was burying the evidence before the bodies were even cold. We must also address the maintenance issues, Arthur continued, his voice hardening. I've already ordered the grounding of the entire fleet. We'll be conducting an internal audit of all security and janitorial staff who had access to the roof last night. We can't rule out foul play from disgruntled elements. Maya's blood turned to ice. He was setting her up. He was going to blame the invisible girl for the crash he had engineered. She didn't run. Instead, she straightened her apron and walked into the boardroom. The room went silent. A dozen executives in tailored suits stared at the black woman in the blue cleaning uniform, standing at the head of their mahogany table. "Get out," Arthur hissed, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Can't you see we are in the middle of a crisis?" Quote, "I heard you talking about the helicopter, Mr. Penhaligon," Maya said, her voice steady, echoing with the authority of a command deck. "I heard you talking about disgruntled elements, but you forgot to mention the FADEC bypass you installed." Arthur's eyes widened, a flicker of pure, predatory fear crossing his face. "You're delusional. Security, escort this woman out." Quote, "I'm not leaving," Maya said, stepping closer to the table. The executives looked confused, but Maya's presence was suddenly undeniable. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a predator. "I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the gambling debts to the Santino family. And I know that at 4,500 feet, you expected Julian Sterling to die." Arthur let out a forced, high-pitched laugh. "And who are you? A maid? A failure who couldn't make it in the real world? You have no proof. You have nothing but a mop and a vivid imagination." "I have the flight logs from the diagnostic port," Maya lied, a tactical bluff, "and I have a recording of your phone call from 2 a.m. Arthur lunged across the table, his composure shattering. "You bitch. You think anyone will believe you? You're a nobody. You're a ghost." Quote, suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with such force they hit the walls. The room gasped. Standing in the doorway was Julian Sterling. He was a mess. His clothes were torn. His face was smeared with dried salt and sand, and his left arm was in a makeshift sling. But his eyes were like cold steel. Behind him stood two grim-faced men in dark suits. FBI agents. "Actually, Arthur," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I believe her." Arthur collapsed back into his chair, his face turning the color of ash. He looked from Julian to Maya, the realization hitting him like a physical blow, that nobody hadn't just survived. She had won. Julian walked slowly toward the head of the table, ignoring the stunned silence of his board. He stopped right in front of Maya. He didn't look at his executives. He looked only at her. "You left something in my cockpit," Julian said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Bronze Star Challenge coin. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the boardroom table with a heavy clink, right in the center of the Sterling Global logo. "Tell me, Maya," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "How does a chief warrant officer end up cleaning my floors?" Quote, the boardroom felt smaller than it had moments ago. The FBI agents moved in, the metallic click of handcuffs on Arthur's wrist sounding like a gavel on his career. The CFO was let out in a stunned, pathetic silence, but Julian didn't even glance at the man who had tried to kill him. His focus was entirely on the woman in the blue uniform. "The board is dismissed," Julian said, his voice cold and final. Now, the executives scrambled out, leaving Maya and Julian alone in the vast, glass-walled room. Julian picked up the challenge coin from the table, turning it over in his fingers. "I looked up the unit insignia while I was in the back of the rescue Humvee," Julian said quietly. 101st Airborne. Dust off, crew. You weren't just a pilot. Maya, you were a ghost rider. You flew into active fire zones to pull dying men out of holes in the dirt. Maya stood her ground, her hands clasped behind her back in a parade rest that she didn't even realize she was doing. I did my job, Mr. Sterling. Your job? Julian let out a hollow, self-deprecating laugh. I spent last night mocking you for not knowing what a cyclic was. I told you that your place was on the floor. And then, when the world turned upside down at 5,000 feet, the only reason I didn't become a permanent part of the Atlantic seabed was because you were smarter, faster, and more disciplined than every Ivy League-trained engineer in this building. He stepped closer, the smell of salt and jet fuel still clinging to him. Why are you here, Maya? With a record like yours, you could be flying for anyone. You could be running an airfield. Why are you emptying my trash? Quote, Maya's gaze finally flickered, the hollow stare Julian had mocked earlier filled with a sudden, painful light. Fallujah, she said, the word barely a whisper. 6 years ago, I was flying a medevac under heavy RPG fire. We had 4 critically wounded soldiers on board. I took a hit to the tail rotor. I stayed with the bird. I brought it down in a controlled crash. Just like Miller did today. She took a shaky breath. I saved my crew. I saved the wounded. But the sound of the metal twisting, the smell of the fuel, it never left me. When I got home, I couldn't hear a car backfire without looking for a landing zone. I was diagnosed with severe PTSD. The FAA pulled my medical certification. They told me I was a liability in the cockpit. Julian watched her, his arrogance completely stripped away. I took the janitor job because it was quiet, Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. I didn't want to be responsible for lives anymore. I just wanted to disappear. But then I heard Arthur. I saw that beautiful machine on the roof, and I realized he was going to turn it into a coffin. I couldn't let that happen. Not again. Julian looked at the coin, then back at Maya. He realized that for all his billions, he had never possessed a fraction of the character standing in front of him. He had looked at her for months and seen a waitress, never realizing he was in the presence of a decorated hero who had forgotten how to fly because the world had broken her heart. They told you that you were a liability? Julian asked, his eyes burning with a new kind of fire. Yes, sir. Well, Julian said, straightening his torn jacket, the FAA might have grounded you, but they don't own Sterling Global, and they certainly don't own me. He walked to the window, looking out at the city he thought he had conquered, only to realize he had been blind to its true strength. Maya, I don't just want an apology. I want to burn the old way this company operates to the ground. And I need someone who knows how to handle the heat. Julian turned away from the window, the morning sun silhouetting his battered frame. He looked at Maya, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as a man who had finally seen the truth through a cracked windshield. I'm firing the entire aviation safety board, Julian said, his voice flat and decisive. They missed the sabotage, they missed the corruption, and most importantly, they missed you. Maya blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. Sir, I'm just a night shift worker with a revoked medical. You were a night shift worker, Julian corrected. He stepped toward the boardroom table and tapped the mahogany surface. As of this moment, I am creating a new position. Chief of Strategic Flight Safety and Veteran Integration. It reports directly to me. No middle managers. No board interference. He paused, his eyes softening. And the first task of this office? We are launching the Robert Blackwood Foundation, named after my father, who was a veteran himself. Its sole mission will be to provide the most advanced neurological therapy and flight recertification programs for veterans with PTSD. We're going to buy the best simulators, hire the best doctors, and we're going to get you, and others like you, back into the pilot's seat. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. For years, she had lived in the gray, quiet of her own trauma, believing the sky was a closed door. Now, Julian was handing her the keys to the entire building. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Why go to all this trouble for a variable like me? Quote, Julian reached out, his hand hovering near the challenge coin. Because you saved my life when I didn't deserve it. You saw a man who insulted you, who looked down on you, and you chose to be his guardian angel anyway. That's not just skill, Maya. That's a level of greatness I haven't seen in any boardroom. He looked around the cold, sterile room. This company has been built on ego and numbers. It's hollow. I want to fill it with people who have Ghost Rider DNA. I want Sterling Global to be a place where the invisible people are finally seen. Maya looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. The ghost of Fallujah was still there. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a haunting. It felt like a mission. I have a condition, Mr. Sterling, Maya said, her chin lifting. Julian smiled, the first real, non-predatory smile she had ever seen on his face. Name it. I don't want an office in the penthouse, she said. I want my desk in the hangar. And I want the authority to hire my own team from the invisible staff of this building. There's a guy in the mailroom who was a marine logistics specialist. And a woman in security who was an Air Force mechanic. They're wasting away here. I want them. Julian nodded slowly. Consider it done. You start now. But first, he gestured to her blue cleaning uniform. Go home, get some sleep, and burn that apron. Tomorrow, you come in through the front door. Maya picked up her challenge coin from the table. She felt the weight of it. The weight of her past and the incredible potential of her future. As she walked toward the elevator, she passed the janitorial closet she had lived out of for months. She didn't look back. The elevator doors opened. For the first time in 6 years, Maya Vance didn't feel like she was hiding. She felt like she was pre-flighting. 1 year later, the rooftop of Sterling Global looked different. The cold, sterile floodlights had been replaced by a warmer, more inviting glow. The Vance Sterling Veteran Center logo was etched into the glass of the observation deck, where a group of young veterans stood, watching the skyline with a sense of belonging they hadn't felt in years. Julian Sterling stood by the edge of the helipad, his hands in his pockets. He was no longer the sharp-edged, cruel man who had mocked a spill at a gala. He looked relaxed, his eyes scanning the horizon not for stock tickers, but for a specific flight tail number. The sound came first, a distant, rhythmic thumping that resonated in the chest. A sleek, midnight blue Sikorsky S-76 appeared over the Hudson River, banking with a grace that suggested the pilot and the machine were sharing the same nervous system. The helicopter approached the pad. The landing was textbook, a perfect flare, a soft touch, and a gradual power down that spoke of absolute mastery. The turbine whine faded, and the rotors slowed to a halt. The pilot stepped out. She wasn't wearing a waitress's apron or a blue janitorial jumpsuit. She was wearing a tailored flight suit with Maya Vance, Chief of Aviation, embroidered in gold. Over her heart, Maya walked toward Julian, her helmet under her arm. Her hollow stare was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused clarity of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. How was the test flight, Chief? Julian asked, smiling as she approached. The new neurological interface controls are responsive, Maya said, her voice rich with satisfaction. The Foundation's first 3 candidates passed their simulator trials today. They'll be ready for solo flight by the end of the month. Julian looked at the aircraft, then back at the woman who had saved him in more ways than one. I still remember the first thing you ever said to me after the crash. You told me you wanted to find the invisible people. We've hired over 200 veterans this year. Maya, the company's productivity is up. And for the first time, I don't feel like I'm running a kingdom of ghosts. Maya looked out at the city. She could see the building where she used to scrub floors in the dark, hoping no one would notice her. Now, her name was on the letterhead of a global initiative. You know, Maya said, reaching into her flight suit pocket and pulling out the Bronze Star Challenge coin. It was worn smooth from a year of being carried as a reminder. I used to think my place was on the floor because I was broken. I thought the PTSD was a cage. She handed the coin to Julian. He took it, looking at the inscription sign Metu. It wasn't a cage, Maya continued. It was just a different kind of training. It taught me how to see the things people like you ignore. It taught me that the most dangerous variable isn't a mechanical failure. It's forgetting the humanity of the people around you. Julian nodded, a moment of profound silence passing between them. He handed the coin back. I'll never forget again. Just then, a young man in a technician's uniform, a former army mechanic Maya had rescued from a dead-end warehouse job, approached them. Chief Vance? The board is waiting for the safety briefing. And Julian, your 2 p.m. is here. Maya and Julian shared a look. A partnership forged in a 5,000-foot death spiral. Let's go, Julian said, gesturing toward the executive elevator. But Maya? You lead the way. As they walked toward the doors, Maya Vance didn't look like a waitress, a janitor, or even just a pilot. She looked like a leader. She had spent years cleaning up other people's messes. Now, she was finally the one deciding where the world was going to fly. The invisible girl was gone. The Ghost Rider was back.